Hey guys, today's story is about a guy that had a Xbox gamer tag and their girlfriend. So, I'll start off by giving you all some context. I've always been interested in the storytelling aspects of RPGs. However, I haven't had the greatest of experiences when trying to get into traditional TTRPGs like D&D. So, around 7 or 8 years ago, when I was still in high school, some friends that I met through World of Warcraft suggested that I could GM, if you could even call it that, a sort of a choose-your-own-adventure style session for them that was primarily focused on plot and RP. The actual mechanics were very simplistic, and pretty much only there to settle the occasional dispute, since the purpose of the whole thing was a sort of collaborative writing adventure, where the main focus was to tell a story with me acting as the story's narrator. To this day, I'm not sure whether they came up with the concept on their own, or if this style of play has an official name. They literally just called it a narrative RPG. I'm sure the more experienced amongst you could tell me whether that's a thing or not. Now, I've never been much of an RPer, but I am, or at least I'd like to think, a passable writer, especially considering that English isn't my first language. So, in spite of my reluctance, I eventually agreed to create a narrative for their characters. And given the rules-light nature of the game, a lot of the restrictions had to be enforced by the lore and just general common sense. But I rarely had anyone going into business for themselves, since doing so would have been counterintuitive to everyone's enjoyment. There are ways to get your character killed if you really wanted to, but I had no incentive to deliberately stifle anyone, nor did the players have any reason to go out of their way to pick fights that they couldn't win. Overall, it was a surprisingly fun time and gave me a chance to flex my creative muscles. I started putting more and more effort into the world, crafting stories and adventures my players could choose to partake in, with different outcomes depending on their actions or inactions. That is, until a player I'll refer to as just Jane came along. Jane started as a new and pretty active member of the World of Warcraft guild my friends and I were a part of. She and one of said friends, henceforth referred to as Loverboy XXX because he'll read this and I'm feeling petty, had apparently grown close and were all up in each other's DMs. Nothing wrong with that, but at some point he had even told her about our group's weekly online sessions and invited her to join. I was officially introduced to Jane via voice chat, and I gave her a rundown of the setting, the current campaign's progress, and the general guidelines for designing her character. She seemed pretty receptive to it all, and was eager to join in on the party's adventures, even going the extra mile by making her first character my world's equivalent of a healer, so that the party, who were a tight-knit band of former cutthroats, had an incentive to bring her along. It created an interesting dynamic where Jane's sheltered character grew accustomed to the world at the same rate that she did, bringing some much-needed contrast to the party's composition. And if I absolutely had to nitpick, I'd say that she liked playing the role of the damsel in distress a bit too often for my liking. But no one else seemed to mind, so I refrained from commenting on it at the time. And without going too much into detail, the setting was a blend between traditional fantasy, Egyptian mythology, and Turkish folklore, where the party often had to leave the safety of the capital and venture into the untamed desert in search for long-forgotten tombs, treasure, and the like. Following the party's decision to side with the guards during an uprising, they were invited to the palace, where they were to meet and be congratulated by the royal family themselves for playing a pivotal role in subduing the rebellion. Pleasantries were exchanged and meaningless titles were granted, before the party were sent off back to their base in the slums. If that sounds underwhelming, well, that's because that was the point. I was trying to establish how detached the nobles were from the plight of their subjects, Despite all of my efforts to write them as condescending dicks, one of the members of the royal family, who I'll just refer to as the prince for simplicity's sake, seemed to have left an impression on Jane's character. To clarify, the prince was the youngest of the king's sons, and the embodiment of narcissism. I wrote him to be douchey and elitist as possible, which made the healer's sudden crush on him all the more baffling. While, yes, I described him as physically attractive, that was literally his only redeeming quality. There was no shortage of traditionally attractive NPCs and player characters surrounding her constantly, if she really wanted to go down that route. That said, Jane's character was meant to be naive, so I figured her swooning over a guy that despises everything that she represents could have been used to highlight her inexperience. Unfortunately, it wasn't anything as self-aware as that. Both in and out of character, Jane kept bringing the prince up, much to the rest of the party's annoyance. She insisted that they fully align themselves with the crown in the hopes that they could earn more favor, while simultaneously also asking me when they would meet them again. And as you can probably guess, Loverboy was particularly and quite vocally against this for obvious reasons. Perhaps I should have been more stern in railroading them away from that entire plot line, but in my defense, I was really committed to adapting to everyone's choices. Jane got her way eventually, dragging everyone along with her and forcing me to come up with more and more stuff that they could do for the local gentry. I made a point of clearly telling her that their efforts were appreciated, but it wasn't getting them any closer to another audience with the prince. And keep in mind that this was an NPC that I hadn't even put that much thought into at the time, since I never expected him to be anything beyond an entitled prick whose entire purpose was to symbolize the blatant disconnect between the common man and the ruling class. I could have, and eventually did, flesh him out more, but at the time, nobody apart from Jane cared about him enough to justify doing that. Loverboy was getting pretty fed up by Jane's infatuation with my NPC, and out of character, demanded that we move on to something else. I explained that I've been presenting them with different plot hooks the entire time, but instead they just kept catering to her healer's whims, who had pretty much assumed somewhat of a de facto leader role. If nothing else, the mental image of a ragtag group of ardent outlaws following around a teenaged girl pursuing her crush was sort of amusing. Finally picking up on the group's frustration, Jane relented and we were allowed to move on to something else. And it was at this point when Loverboy's character tried to get closer to Jane's, which, while awkward at times, at least it made sense since they had a thing in real life. Both of their characters were of similar age, and it didn't interfere with my storytelling. Jane was open-minded to the idea, but didn't seem particularly excited about it. Her healer and his cutthroat continued with their in-character flirting throughout several campaigns, but their relationship never evolved past the occasional innuendo or remark. All was well until that fateful evening when I saw that Jane had messaged me several times on Skype. And when I opened our conversation, I saw paragraph upon paragraph of her, I'm assuming in character, since most of it was surrounded by quotation marks, proclaiming her love for the prince, and straight up demanding to meet him again. Now, it's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly what she said, but I distinctly remember her threatening to leave the friend group altogether if I didn't make it happen. She went on to guilt-trip me by saying that it would have been my fault if Loverboy, and I kid you not, killed himself over her leaving without a word, since she was apparently helping him battle through some mental issues none of us were aware of. I honestly had no idea how to react. I remember just sitting there, reading through her messages and trying to formulate some sort of adequate reply in my head. Eventually, I settled on the worst thing that I could have probably done. I proposed to narrate a private, non-canon exchange between her healer and my NPC. Obviously, she agreed and was pretty enthusiastic about it. As if she just didn't threaten my friend's mental health in order to get her way. I have no excuse for choosing to indulge her instead of just immediately talking to Loverboy about the whole thing. I guess I was both worried about him and scared of our friend group disbanding, which eventually happened anyway, but over an unrelated incident. Fast forward to the day of my private session with Jane. The scene opened with the prince standing on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens, and her character being invited into his quarters. I obviously knew what she was after, so I made up some crappy reason as to why he had taken a sudden interest in her, but sadly, I don't remember exactly what it was. Both expressed their inexplicable infatuation with each other, and things obviously got heated. So I hurriedly faded to black. Only Jane wasn't having it. She was basically expecting me to ERP with her, something that I had never done and had no interest in doing. I explained to her that, at the time, I wasn't really interested in exploring sexual stuff, both in and out of character. And then, cue the porn. That's right, folks. Jane seemed to have thought that all I needed was some inspiration, and so, in her infinite wisdom, proceeded to spam me pictures and gifs of explicit acts that she wanted my character to do to hers. Then she went on to make the whole thing 10 times weirder by expressing how this sort of content was making her feel. And while both of us were 18 at the time, I still don't feel comfortable recounting her exact words verbatim. Let's just say that she was making me increasingly uncomfortable, until she left me no choice but to tell her off, which she took as well as you'd expect. She left the group soon after and blocked all of us, including Loverboy, who took it hard but got over it, after confiding in the rest of us instead. I'm not quite sure what Jane has been up to since then. I had seen her mentioned in passing a few times before our WoW guild got disbanded for good, since most of us moved on to other games or hobbies. She's apparently married now, so I genuinely wish her all the best, and hope that she's grown as a person since the above-mentioned incident. Only recently did Loverboy and I reconnect, who you can thank for reminding me about Jane and directing me to the subreddit. It's a mildly uncomfortable experience at best compared to the other stories that I've read on here, but I thought it might still be worth sharing. And just to be clear, I'm not implying that my friend did anything wrong in the scenario. The ridiculous nickname that I've given him is just a harmless in-joke between us that I like teasing him about. Well guys, what's there to really say? If Loverboy did in fact actually have mental illness, and Jane completely disregarded this person that they supposedly had any amount of feelings for, just so they could get their kicks in a imaginary way, then I would say that he definitely was better off without her. And needless to say, to anyone that does want to DM, if someone is trying to force you to do something for them, have a backbone. Don't do it. Depending on the circumstance, you might need to talk to someone else, like in this case Loverboy, or the party at all. But that's the end of this story. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and, as always, have a good one.